Good afternoon. My name is Michael Morandi, and on behalf of the Executive Committee, I want to welcome you to today's talk. I want to especially thank the Friends for your generous support. As you may know, funds raised by the Friends are used in part to support one visiting scholar, we call them members here, in each of the 4 schools. Our speaker today, Deva Woodley, is this year's Friends member in the School of Social Science. Deva has a PhD in political science from University of Chicago, serves on the faculty of the New School for Social Research, and is here this year in part to convert her PhD dissertation into a book which is to be published by Oxford University Press. Deva's work focuses on the ways that political discourse affects the political choices of ordinary citizens, candidates, and mass media, as well as the American political landscape as a whole. When I met with Deva last week, I said, geez, you had a PhD in 2008. You're probably not up for sabbatical. How did you get here for a whole year? She kind of looked at me and said, well, when you get accepted by the Institute for Advanced Study, your university gives you a break. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Deva.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm just going to go right into it. The introductory remarks, I think, are quite true. I'm here sort of on a lark. I applied and happened to get accepted, and I told my university, and they were just like, really? And I was like, really? So here I am. Okay. This talk is sort of a broad overview of the book that I've been working on all year and that I'm finishing very soon, I hope, called Changing Politics, New Issue Acceptance and the American Way. How do social movements secure lasting political change? Any astute observer of politics could list some characteristics of successful social movements, such as recruiting and empowering members in an expanding social movement organization, raising public awareness, winning allies across a broad swath of the public, and convincing power holders to change policy in their desired direction. But are there some kinds of movement success that lead to lasting political change more readily than others? In this book, I offer a theory of new issue acceptance to explain how social movements achieve sustained, meaningful change, illustrated through a theoretical and empirical investigation of 2 contemporary movements, the push for marriage equality and the fight to attain a living wage. I argue that the critical battleground for these movements is what Habermas calls the general public sphere, the dynamic and elusive world of mediated discourse in which most of our public and political communication happens, but which has received little attention from political theorists. By illuminating the works of this discursive realm, I hope to reveal it as an underrated, even indispensable resource for political challengers, and to establish a new framework for analyzing the progress of individual social movements toward what I call political acceptance. I argue that politics is not merely a series of policy battles, but an ongoing struggle shaped by the meanings that we make. Using the examples of these movements, I attempt to play out the implications of this notion of how we evaluate the politics of political challengers and the effect that it has on the likelihood of political change. The marriage equality and living wage campaigns both appeared as self-declared movements in the early 1990s and by similar indigenous political processes. But by the mid-2000s, a startling and counterintuitive phenomenon had emerged. Although the living wage movement had scored much higher on many of the indicators of traditional politics, that is, shaping and passing favorable policies, it was marriage equality that seemed to be having the most impact on the national political landscape by influencing national campaigns, shaping the contours of national discourse, and affecting the common modalities of public opinion. Now, this talk focuses on my theory, basically. But if we have time at the end, I have a few slides full of data that I'd love to talk you through as well. But you have to pick and choose in these limited times. Okay? So the living wage movement enabled the passage of over 120 local ordinances which guaranteed workers, usually city contractors, but sometimes all businesses that received financial assistance from the city in terms of tax breaks or other kinds of financial assistance, to up their wages to a minimum that would cover a family of four to live above the poverty level, right, or at or above the poverty level. Usually, these ordinances include an allowance for health care. So either the businesses have to provide health care for these covered employees, or they have to pay an extra $2 or $3 so that employees can theoretically buy health care on their own. This is what makes the living wage different actually from the minimum wage, which I think most people are more familiar with. Minimum wages are set at the national level, right, whereas living wages are targeted and local in their reach. So the living wage movement, which began in Baltimore in 1994, was able, by the year 2004, to pass over 120 local ordinances all over the United States. This guaranteed municipal employees and contractors raises in varying amounts. However, this policy success, that is, the formal success of the policy passing through the local and sometimes even the state legislators, was marred by a number of ambiguous outcomes. For example, local living wage movements are often highly energized and successfully lean on municipal politicians to support their legislation in the moment of the campaign, but most states keep few or no records about how living wage ordinances have affected their locale after the moment of passage. Further, many ordinances remain un- or under-enforced, with no apparatus for sanction or oversight to appeal to in order to see that the laws on the books are followed. Perhaps most important for the movement, neither the general publics in the locales where the ordinances are passed, nor certainly national audiences, seem to be familiar with or politicized around the issue beyond the tenure of the local campaign. Fundamentally, despite hotly contested legislative victories, the public's ideas about the relationship between government, capital, and citizens remain unchanged even after the very dazzling policy success. That may mean that movement leaders have generated little public interest and created next to no national public awareness, garnering only slight political capital to deploy on related issues that are important to them about labor and fairness. The movement for marriage equality, on the other hand, suffered during this period between 94 and 04 numerous judicial and legislative defeats, and even incited an extremely hostile counter-movement that resulted in 33 states passing constitutional amendments defining marriage as a union between one man and one woman, and 8 additional states passing some form of legislation defining marriage in the same way. That's a total of 41 states passing some kind of legislation against this movement's preferred policy outcomes. However, despite these policy losses, somehow the idea of gay marriage had become an issue of national attention, causing officials at all levels of government to take stands on the merits of marriage equality, forcing them to articulate arguments for or against what had previously been unthinkable inclusion. In addition, even when marriage equality advocates were losing judicial and legislative battles, their deliberate and disciplined discursive campaign to persuade Americans on the merits of marriage equality seemed to be succeeding. As indicators of public acceptance for gay rights broadly, although not immediately gay marriage specifically, including support for a policy accommodation that was eventually offered in the year 2000, civil unions, rose quickly and steadily. In my research, I have found that advocates for marriage equality found through interviews, I should say, that advocates for marriage equality deliberately sought to make a compelling case to a wide American audience that marriage is a matter of equal civil rights, and as such, infused the issue with a gravitas that merited continual revisiting in the national political conversation, even as it also inspired a political backlash. It was a framing that ultimately, over a period of years, outdid the conservative counterframes that attempted to define same-sex marriage as morally perverse, politically out of step, and culturally dangerous. This is because marriage equality advocates sought to create a resonant frame and persisted in introducing and reintroducing that frame into mainstream public discourse in a consistent way over a period of time until even opponents were forced to articulate their opposition in terms that forced them to defend themselves rather than being able to advance a positive position. So while the marriage equality movement enjoyed few judicial and legislative victories and suffered many crushing defeats over the period that I study, advocates nevertheless successfully persuaded the American polity of the merits of their case and the viability of their solution to benefit previously invisible gay families. Now, it's important to dally on this point. In the time period, advocates for marriage equality did not convince the American public to be on their side. Public opinion was strongly opposed to marriage equality up until about 2008, right? And then you used to get a 49, I'm extemporaneous, you just have to bear with me, right? Then you used to get a 49-51 split that was very close. And it wasn't until actually 2012 when you started seeing consistent majorities of the American public, right? And it's still a slim majority, it's still 51-49, it's just on the pro side, not the anti side, that favored marriage equality, okay? So this strategy, this dogged strategy, has continued to succeed in the years since 2004. And at the time of this writing, American majorities now consistently favor marriage equality. The sitting president of the United States announced his personal support for the issue. 3 states, Maine, Maryland, and Washington, voted to legalize the right by referendum during the 2012 election. And 1, Minnesota, rejected a constitutional amendment to ban the practice. Not only that, but the Supreme Court has agreed to hear 2 cases, has heard 2 cases that may determine the federal question of whether same-sex marriage must be made legal in the United States at the federal level. The living wage, on the other hand, has suffered the disbanding of the lead organization, ACORN, due to a smear campaign spearheaded by media provocateurs and congressional Republicans. And this smear campaign succeeded not because the organization was weak. It boasted more dues-paying members in more places than it ever had before, by some counts 500,000. But because while the organization had built power and influence among its base and among legislators and political officials, it had little presence in the awareness of the general public. That means when congressional Republicans in particular came hunting, the organization ACORN and the issue that they had been pushing, the living wage, had no public understanding or benefit of the doubt reputational resources for themselves, nor their main issues to fall back on. These developments mark a sea change in the momentum of the first movement and evidence of the crippling inertia in the life of the other. And the lessons that these 2 movements during this period and beyond, which emerged at the same time, have to teach students of American politics and social movements are manifold. First and foremost, I think that the lesson is there is more to being a successful social movement than winning immediate or direct favorable policy outcomes in either the legislative or judicial arenas. Social movements have their most lasting and permanent effects, I argue, not through particular policy victories, but instead by changing politics itself, by rewriting the discursive field upon which political possibilities and alternatives are considered and wherein binding decisions will be made. So then, how can political challengers, the authors of social movements, change politics in this way? I argue that this kind of change generally, and the outcomes of these 2 contemporary struggles in particular, are rooted in mainstream democratic discourse, specifically in a phenomenon that I call political acceptance, whereby an issue takes on national importance so that it is routinely covered by media, attended to by the public, that means the public is aware of it, and addressed by elected officials. In this book, I develop a theory that I call new issue acceptance in order to explain how and why marriage equality achieved political acceptance in this time period, while the living wage did not. This theory focuses on the ways that mass-mediated public discourse functions as a major site of power, right? A major potential site of power for political challengers seeking to alter the status quo distributions of power, privilege, and influence. This is counterintuitive given that these challengers were, at their emergence, right, both the marriage equality advocates and the living wage advocates, at a disadvantage vis-a-vis the regular arrangements of political influence, stigma, and access, including financial resources, but also discursive resources such as access to mass media and decision-making elites. However, my research demonstrates that political challengers such as social movement actors can influence mainstream political discourse over time in such a way that they are able to gain enough credibility to contest not only particular public officials and their policy preferences, but even standing conceptions of what is politically possible, desirable, and just. In this way, challengers obtain both a hearing for their views and an opportunity to change the structure of political conflict, so that everyone, including their traditionally more powerful opponents, must begin debating their issue, taking into account the way the challengers have framed the debate. This project is based on the assumption that what is said and the way it is said matters in contemporary democratic politics. What is also true, both intuitively and empirically, is that who is doing the talking makes a difference. When an official announces his or her position or the Speaker of the House declares a new agenda, the complicated machinery that serves as the conduit for political information in our massive democracy kicks into gear and the communication process begins. It is a process that is mediated in a number of ways, chiefly by the routines and practices of news media organizations, the sentries at the gate of the public sphere, but also by the predispositions and core values that people already hold, as well as what Pierre Bourdieu, the sociologist, terms the commonplaces or easily accessible and generally accepted background concepts and the logics that connect them of what is usual, appropriate, and true in a particular society at a particular time. The entire environment in which people's preferences are shaped by and interact with commonly held notions is what Aristotle terms the endoxa. It is important to note that these background values and common sense logics are neither static nor invulnerable to questioning, doubt, or change, but neither do they inevitably evolve. Rather, endoxa changes when it is challenged in such a way that these background knowledges no longer seem functional, right, or true. Or put differently, when a group is able to articulate a challenge to long-held wisdom or habit that provokes questions about what has up until that point been either unconsidered or considered natural and irrevocable. In the contemporary American political system, activists and advocates play a key role in highlighting how long-standing common sense logics are connected or disconnected from avowed values about what counts as the good life, and without their efforts, the maintenance of status quo practices and policies is the most likely outcome. This maintenance of status quo arrangements of power and privilege may happen for several reasons, the simplest being that many people value consistency and require good reasons to change. This is especially true, I might add, for elected officials, since their overarching interest is in having voters return them to their office. All things being equal, it is easier for them to win re-election in a political environment that does not deviate too much than the one in which their election was first obtained. Or, as Douglas McAdam puts it, political action by established polity members resists changes which would threaten their current realization of their interest even more than they seek changes which would enhance their interests, right? So put in plain English, politicians would like politics to say exactly the same as it is when they're first elected because they know they can win in that environment. Once you change things, it introduces uncertainty, and they don't want uncertainty, right? Why? Because as David Mayhew, the famous political scientist, says, they are single-minded seekers of re-election, even more than, and they do, right, have policy preferences which they sincerely believe and pursue, okay? Therefore, the impetus for political change must come from coalitions of people outside the office-holding elite. It's important to note that this stimulation from the outside can be wanted, right, and even needed for officials who may want to advance a new policy but feel unable to push for major change without a demonstrable grassroots groundswell to legitimize and support their efforts. When it comes to promoting political change, all parties, activists, lobbyists, journalists, and elected officials are acting under constraints. Still, as has been well established, those with access to resources like large sums of money, high skills, professional political experience, and on down that line, are able to make their impact felt more swiftly and directly than grassroots activists and advocates who must work through the slower and more indirect channel of the public sphere. Now, in order for political challengers to win a hearing from the public and to be able to demand the action of officials and other elites, this is what they must do. They have to successfully convince both groups, that is, elites and the public, that their problem is an issue that ought to concern the entire polity, and that their problem is solvable. That means groups must succeed at what E.E. Schattschneider has referred to as the socialization of conflict. The socialization of conflict enables new issue acceptance and is crucial for the process of political change for several reasons. First, the socialization of conflict facilitates the politicization of the issues involved. As awareness of a particular conflict diffuses to a wider populace, the disagreement between the parties involved can no longer be treated as outside the purview of political negotiation. That is, you can't say something is non-negotiable when people are talking about it in the streets. Second, the socialization of conflict facilitates the integration of the dispute into the current aspects of law, policy, and governance, or the larger political environment. Meaning that once a new issue starts to be talked about, then people wonder, well, what does this have to do with the other kinds of issues that I care about? What are the legal implications? What are the implications for political candidates, etc.? Third, the socialization of conflict creates the opportunity for the groups in conflict to vie for both public authority and public favor. Now, I employ these concepts, public authority and public favor, as distinct and separate. Public authority is a matter of right, that an individual or group is judged by the polity to be credentialed to speak and be heard in the public sphere, while public favor is a matter of agreement, that an individual or group has succeeded in winning explicit majority support for their position. As the examples of these two movements indicate, the majority of the public may grant one without granting the other. That is to say, in the case of the living wage and minimum wages more generally, huge majorities that you usually never see in public opinion research support raising minimum wages, right, and support living wages. However, they are unwilling to punish their elected officials for not implementing these demands, right? Whereas in the case of marriage equality, particularly in the period, public opinion was hugely, right, vastly against granting the right of gay marriage. However, the way that marriage equality advocates entered into the debate made the public grant them public authority in terms of the importance of their issue, right? We disagree with you, but we agree that this is an important issue that has to be talked about, okay? All right. So, in fact, as I just said, because I extemporaneous, these two cases, it is the case that the American public dispersed one to the other, but not to the other. Okay. So finally, because the socialization of conflict brings disputes into the public sphere, facilitates politicization, and provides the opportunity to vie for public authority, it also creates the conditions under which new issue acceptance can become possible. Now, Schattschneider asserts that the root of all politics, the universal language of politics, is conflict. He argues that all conflicts include two involved parties, the combatants and the audience. Nothing attracts a crowd, he writes, so quickly as a fight. Based on this premise, he develops three propositions. First, that the outcome of every conflict is determined by the extent to which the audience becomes involved in it. Second, that the most important strategy of politics, any politics, is the estimation of both the actual and potential scope of conflict. That is, no other single element of political contest is as influential and predictive as the degree to which the conflict has diffused into the awareness and concern of the larger polity. Third, that conflicts that are kept private, the relative strengths of the participants, as it is ascertained and advanced, is very likely to predict that the stronger party will be the one to enforce its will on the weaker. In conflicts that do not have a wider audience, the stronger party can accomplish this enforcement of its will at relatively little cost. That means they don't have to justify themselves to anyone. Okay? However, when a conflict diffuses beyond the borders of the direct parties involved, the balance of power in the fight may change. The stronger side can find itself on shaky ground, not able to simply impose its will, but forced instead to justify the positions the powerful group prefers in front of a concerned audience, opening themselves up to all the uncertainties that are embedded in discussion, including doubt, dissent, and judgment. Conversely, the weaker side may have great potential strength, provided only that it can be aroused in the larger populace, right? Then agreement can be aroused in the larger populace. Of course, these are only possibilities. There is no evidence that American audiences have any particular preference for underdogs, or that the stronger party is always corrupt or wrong and only needs to be revealed as such. On the contrary, the stronger can and do often bring their influence to bear in the public sphere and utilize it to win over the polity. Also, citizens are not necessarily predisposed toward change and may support status quo policies and distributions of power for a number of reasons, including that they simply and genuinely prefer the position of the more powerful party. In other words, the socialization of conflict does not guarantee a win for the group that enters the contest with relatively less power. What it does is give the weaker party a chance to make their case in front of a body of arbiters who may be persuaded that their claims have merit, and finally, support their cause. In this way, citizen observers are an integral, even determining factor in political conflicts. The crowd is loaded, this is Schatzsnyder, is loaded with portentousness because it is apt to be 100 times as large as the fighting minority, and it is never really neutral. The crowd may overwhelmingly throw its support behind one party, split their support between them, or reject the challenger. But two of these three options give the weaker party an advantage that they otherwise would not have had, which are not bad odds. The crowd is not beholden to challengers. In fact, the general public may overtake the original dispute in terms of discourse, offering up nodes of conflict and concern that the contestants eschewed, or tendering resolutions of their own. So great is the change in the nature of any conflict, Schatzsnyder writes, as a consequence of widening involvement of people, that the original participants are apt to lose control of the conflict altogether. These variables make the scope of conflict, or the number of audience members who are interested enough to develop a position on the problem, the most important overlooked X factor in the study of politics. The size, interest, and sympathy of the audience may serve to empower and protect one side while exposing and defeating the other. Taking the scope of the political conflict into account alters the political calculus that must be used to analyze the situation and predict the outcomes. More dramatically put, the scope factor opens up vistas of a new kind of political universe, one in which the politically weak may wrest enough power to contest the claims of the strong, not only through the mobilization of fellow challengers to their cause, but also, and most importantly, by persuading the crowd that their issue is one that deserves political consideration and redress. It is important to note that this socialization of conflict is not automatic, and social movements have to do something in order to make it happen. Challengers can aid in the perception that their issue is worthy of consideration by framing their issue in resonant terms. Social movement sociologists David Snow and Robert Benford adapted the term framing, originally from Irving Goffman, to the study of social movements, arguing that much of the work that challenger groups do is about changing people's ideas about the connections between personal circumstances, political rights and obligations, and the responsibilities of government institutions. They contend that the term to frame refers to an interpretive schemata that simplifies and condenses the world out there by selectively punctuating and encoding objects, situations, events, experiences, and sequences of actions that allow individuals to locate, perceive, identify, and label events in their lives or in the world at large in a way that makes sense. In this way, frames can be used to make diagnostic and prognostic attributions. Relatedly, Albert O. Hirschman contends that in order to inspire people to engage in a politics of resistance, one must combat three default frames, which discourage active involvement in politics. These themes are jeopardy, that is, we risk losing ground if we act now; futility, that attempts to create real change always come to naught; and perverse effects, that unintended negative consequences will be the most likely result and outweigh our desired effects. In the discourse on gay marriage and the living wage, we find that in the discourse on the living wage, there really wasn't direct and sustained attention to combating these default frames which discourage political change: jeopardy, futility, and perverse effects. In fact, the dominant arguments that I found in the news discourse on the living wage across that period emphasize these three terms exactly, right? Whereas in the case of marriage equality, the discourse of advocates was exactly tuned to combat these effects, right? These sort of default frames of jeopardy, futility, and perverse effects, okay? That makes a big difference in whether or not only whether or not people agree with you, which, as I say, is a secondary accomplishment. That's not the first thing movements need to be worried about, right? But whether or not they think that your issue is important and able to be solved, right, by policy action. So together, these discursive anchors set in motion a chain of reasoning that makes inaction seem the only prudent option. Movement organizers must counter these themes using frames that emphasize potential for change. These themes, write William Ganson and David Meyer, have corresponding counter themes that make the opposite point about political opportunity. The counter themes to jeopardy, futility, and perverse effects are urgency, agency, and possibility. This is a rhetoric of change, they say, to combat what Hirschman called the rhetoric of reaction, which discourages political action. If challengers are able to socialize conflict and the scope of the contest continues to broaden, the terms of the conflict, especially if they are in terms that underscore a rhetoric of change rather than the rhetoric of reaction, will become more familiar to a greater number of people. This will happen to an even greater degree if the discourse about the conflict persists over a long period. The successful socialization of conflict is actually quite a rare phenomenon. But in the cases when conflict is both socialized and sustained, it is likely that the new issue, which has paradoxically become familiar, will be accepted onto the short list of topics that the public, the press, and officials regularly discuss, debate, and take positions on. This acceptance creates the possibility that a new issue may not only win a place, but shift other issues around on what Lipset and Rocan term the hierarchy of cleavage bases. That is, the hierarchy of issues that people care about on the national agenda. When audience members repeatedly and regularly identify an issue as a problem, and when I say audience members, I just mean, American citizens in general, right, the general public, repeatedly and regularly identify an issue as a problem, relating it favorably or unfavorably to other political tribulations that they care about and have formed opinions about, then political acceptance has begun to happen. This discursive process reaches the threshold moment of acceptance when official elites take public positions on the new issue and the new issue in question, and offer opinions, call on allies, and finally, most importantly, pitch policy accommodations to the challenger group. Now, it's important to realize that these policy accommodations don't have to be things that the group wins, right? So in the case of marriage equality, the big policy accommodation that triggers what I call political acceptance happens in the year 2000 when Vermont passes the civil union law, right, in response to the series of Supreme Court cases in a variety of states that seem to be calling into question the equal opportunity clauses of their various constitutions. In that case, that was a state law that only affected Vermont. However, it became a policy accommodation that various elected officials and other kinds of elites started to talk about as a solution to the problem that everyone had already accepted, right, as in need of redress. Now, that solution was not the solution that the marriage equality movement desired, right, but it indicated that they had already had a significant win, right? Okay. So what makes that happen is the public gaze, specifically the possibility that the public may side with the less powerful. And that is the element of the political contest that makes bottom-up political change possible. This requires that political challengers be engaged with the public sphere through the mass media. And in order to do this effectively, it is important that movements frame their issues in intelligible and potentially resonant terms. As Schatzsnyder writes, nothing could be more mistaken than to suppose that public authority merely registers the dominance of the strong over the weak. The mere existence of public order has already ruled out a great variety of forms of private pressure. And without that private pressure, sometimes arguments are allowed to stand on their own. This means that in the public sphere, marginalized voices have a chance to influence the political behaviors and decisions of even the most powerful officials and other elites. And I would add, it even has a chance to alter the prevalence of the ideologies that they hold inviolable. But the only element that can make advocates equal to the ensconced power of elites and help widen the scope of political conflict to include the intention of those not directly involved is public authority. Now, there are several steps that advocates must take in order to win public authority. The first step to winning public authority is to gain a platform from which the group can disseminate ideas. This is usually the formation of a group. The way to complete this step, right, is through exposure. For people with few resources, this exposure can only be secured through the emergence into mainstream public discourse through news media. That is, people with lots of resources can do an ad campaign, right? They can pay for advertisement. But those with fewer resources must do this from injecting themselves into public discourse through news. In the age of the internet and new media, this emergence is not always direct, right? And the barriers to entry are lower. But it is still the case that mainstream media, and it is the case that mainstream media increasingly looks to political blogs and trending topics on Twitter or viral memes on Tumblr for the latest news. However, as influential as these new domains have become, the broadest audience of people is still reached through traditional television and print news. The second step to obtaining public authority is to craft a consistent and intelligible message, one that plays up the qualities of an issue that will likely resonate with a general interest audience, that the subject is urgent, immediately relevant, and worthy of sustained public attention and consideration, as well as solvable through public policy action. This may seem cynically strategic, but given, and I work with a lot of movement organizations, and a lot of them, particularly the smallest and most grassroots, really reject the idea that they have to frame issues. Their issues should be like self-evidently righteous, right? But it's really important to understand, and when I was in Chicago, I worked with a lot to understand that this is not about cynical strategy, it's just about communication, right? Given the limited number of items that can ever become a part of national political discourse, and the fact that most of these items will be decided by official elites, it should instead be regarded as a pragmatic truth, one that does not automatically imply that groups will have to limit their speech to pandering or dissembling, but instead merely recognizes that challengers will not be successful if they develop messages that do not resonate with a political community wider than their basic membership. Message development in this case should not be thought of as an advertisement for an issue, but instead a clarification of the issue's importance in American political life, right? This is really important because since the first goal of a movement must be acceptance rather than agreement, the first thing that has to be clarified is why the issue is important now and how it can be addressed through public policy. Gaining exposure and crafting a resonant message confers authority to speak in the public sphere upon challenger groups. Social movement actors are given the opportunity to speak in press coverage, to ask questions or make demands of officials, and given greater access to the general public outside their membership when they're able to do this. But this public authority is still only a tool to be used in the quest of new issue acceptance. Political acceptance must be earned by sustaining this effective hearing in mainstream public discourse over time. That is, it must become a persistent object of attention by both officials and the general public. This third step is actually a kind of loop. Officials may pay attention for a number of reasons. Perhaps they have been looking for a grassroots connection for an issue they already champion. And I have to say, this grassroots connection can be either on the pro or anti side, right? Your opponents can do a lot to raise the profile of your issue. Or perhaps they have been seeking out an issue that can serve as a foil for a different policy, an opposite policy that they advocate. However, the chief reason for any public official to remain interested in take a policy position upon a new political issue is that they perceive public interest and attention to be piqued in such a way that they might pay a price for or make gains from their pronouncements and policy positions regarding that new issue. Likewise, mainstream media tends to put the spotlight on issues that officials have pronounced upon, and the political arguments that ensue are those the general public is most likely to encounter and form opinions about. Once this loop gets going, with public interest piqued and officials pronouncing and arguing with one another, which in turn gets reported again as news, galvanizing more and more intense public interest and causing officials to feel the need to take positions, you might be on your way to sustaining this attention loop long enough to create an impetus for policy accommodation. This acceptance, and this is what qualifies as new issue acceptance, the appearance of these policy accommodations. The acceptance of new issues by a broad swath of the polity, one with the public authority that movement actors are able to garner with exposure and a resonant message, allows non-elite political challengers to become formidable voices in public debates with officials and other decision makers. Over time, this gives proponents of new arrangements of power, privilege, and influence the ability to shape public discourse in such a way that even when majorities disagree with the issue position of the challenger group, they accept the political salience of the issue and accord it a place on the national issue agenda. While there are a number of ways to influence public policy, political challengers, especially grassroots political actors, without a ready-made apparatus of Washington-based interest organizations or routine access to elected officials, must go through the public sphere. It is here that such groups are able not only to publicize their organizations or get the word out about their current campaigns, but also, and most importantly, to publicize, that is, make public, the definition of the problem they see and the contours of the logic that lead to their preferred outcomes. For social movements, the difference between long-term success and failure can come down to their ability to win such a hearing in the mainstream public sphere repeatedly and over time, and thus to create new opportunities for policy negotiation, persuading powerful allies to their side, accumulating monetary and other kinds of resources, and eventually, perhaps, prevailing in policy disputes. In other words, When political challengers deliberately seek to make new political issues into common touchstones that can come to change mainstream political discussion, they greatly increase their chances to effect lasting and sometimes even transformational political change. The effects of this kind of challenger-motivated change in the mainstream discursive political landscape is an underrated resource in the practical toolkit of social movements and under-researched in the large and diverse literature on social movements. It is important to note that the policy accommodation offered need not be either what the group has explicitly asked for, and it need not actually be achieved, that is, passed through in legislation. For political acceptance to happen, it must instead become a durable part of the conversation that media reports, the general public is aware of, and elites take positions on. This means that the issue has been accepted as one of the short list of issues that makes up the national agenda during any given period and has changed the political environment.